Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, my own website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz or at Banking Day. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from our website, leongettler.com. I am Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. This is episode number 21 in our series for 2024, and today's date is Friday, June the 21st. First, I'll be talking to Anthony McClure, the Managing Director of Silver Mines. We'll talk about how silver is a vital component in solar, photovoltaic or PV panels, enabling efficient capture and conversion of sunlight into electricity thanks to its unsurpassed electrical conductivity, and how silver's high conductivity and ductility make EVs more efficient by establishing lightweight but strong electrical connections between batteries and other car components. And I'll talk to Indeed economist Callum Pickering about the latest unemployment figures. But first, let's talk to Anthony McClure.
Well, Anthony, tell us about Silver Mines.
So Silver Mines is its main project is called the Bell and Silver Project, located out in near Mudgee in central New South Wales. We're currently by far the largest undeveloped silver project in Australia and one of the largest globally. We've just received development consent, so we've just been through a major milestone, which we're obviously delighted about. So we're getting on with the initial development of it. So initially the project will produce about 6 million ounces of silver a year, plus a bit of zinc, plus a bit of lead, but by far the main product is silver, and then we'll expand from there. So we're in a great position at the moment. We're well supported by government, and we're just getting on with it. So having the development approvals just granted to us was a big step for us.
I believe the mine has a 23-year life. Is that right?
It's actually 16 years, but the project itself is 23 years with rehabilitation and so forth. But we're happy to say, when we say a 16-year mine life, we're happy to say hand in our hearts, but this project will still be in production in 50 years' time. The mineralised system is vast. It's still continuing depth when we keep drilling. We don't know the actual size of it, but as at today, the mineral resource is almost 400 million ounces of silver. So it's a huge project, and we're just tapping into a part of it initially in the phase 1 development.
Now, silver is a fascinating mineral because it's used in solar panels and EVs, isn't it?
Yeah, and the reason for that, Leon, is silver is by far the best electrical conductor out of all the metals. So when you think about an EV, the drive for the engineers is to get the utmost out of the battery. So we're talking about mileage and so forth. And to be able to do that, you need connectivity within the car to maximise the energy output from the battery. So silver's through it. Photovoltaic cells and solar power, they don't work without silver, and that's for the same reason. It's a very good conductor, or the best conductor of electricity. But yeah, it's in everything that we do, and we probably don't know it, but yeah, there's a lot in conventional cars or combustion engine cars. There's through our computers, our phones, 5G towers. It's almost in every electronics you'll have silver, and that's the reason for it is the properties in conducting electricity.
That's quite extraordinary, and of course this mine has potential to expand into zinc and lead as well. Is that right?
Yeah, well, we actually we will be from the outset, we're producing zinc and lead. So roughly 70% of our revenues will be from silver, 20% from zinc, and 10% from lead.
Right, that's quite extraordinary. Now, you're looking at an optimization program to update the Bowden Silver feasibility study?
Yeah, so the feasibility study was done a few years ago now, so we're updating that with. We've recently put out a new resource statement, which shows the continued growth of the mineral resources, and particularly silver. So that now morphs into the development of the ore reserves, so what we can extract, and that's likely to expand. So the pit will, the mine, the open cut pit will get redesigned. We're doing a lot of work on metallurgy. Capital costs will increase, unfortunately, and that's the world we live in with supply chain issues and so forth. But overall, the optimisation program is going to be very much net positive development.
Well, the capital cost would be quite severe, wouldn't it?
Well, for this sort of operation, no, it's not too bad. So it's not a big, massive mine. It's a medium-sized mine. Capital costs in the feasibility were about 250 million Australian dollars. So with the capital cost increase, and yes, the final numbers will come out later this year, but roughly it's going to be over 300 million for the development. That's Aussie dollars.
Right, and of course your investors would be willing to invest in that, obviously.
Oh, it's a really dynamic market at the moment, and silver is in a great position. We're trading at highs. Most of the big institutions out there are predicting silver to go up significantly over the coming years. The demand for silver is growing very, very rapidly. In fact, the silver market is 200 million ounces a year in deficit. So that's driving prices. But with the technologies and the development of the solar power industry in the EV market, the silver market is in really good shape. So when you think about financing this sort of operation, if we're doing it today, we'd do it very quickly and easily. And as you could imagine, we have the bankers in Australia and globally really to help us finance, and we don't see an issue with that whatsoever.
So who are your main competitors here?
Well, silver is mostly derived out of Central and South America. So Mexico is the largest developer in a producer of silver. Chinese are up there as well, and they also recycle a lot of silver. We're number 3. We juggle between 3 and 4 in the world, but that's Australia, that is, and but that's as byproduct credits in other mines, gold mines, lead zinc mines, and so forth. So silver as a standalone commodity in Australia is pretty unusual, but we're still a big producer. But I think that the market is very keen to see silver produced out of tier 1 jurisdictions, and obviously we're that.
Right, okay, as opposed to places like China.
Indeed.
Right, okay. Is there any prospect of recycling the silver here?
Yes, indeed. We have the smelting facilities. So the Broken Hill ores are, the smelting facilities down in Port Pirie in South Australia. So that's the likely transport route for us through Broken Hill, then to South Australia for smelting. But our product can go anywhere else in the world. Really, it can go out through Newcastle, Port Botany, and obviously we'll work that out later this year when we are talking further to the off-takers. But certainly the recycling industry is growing, and that's important. It's growing very quickly at the moment as prices in silver increase and people want to recycle. But a lot of it, unfortunately, gets, when you think about TVs and computers and whatever, you like to think there's a perfect market in recycling, but a lot of it ends up in landfill, unfortunately.
That's very sad.
Yeah. It's with commodity prices increasing, hopefully will get more competitive to be recycling. And the Chinese are good at it. The US is good at it. Australia, it's a growth industry for Australia, and there's been a bit of a drive from government, whether it's state or federal. Silver is regarded, in New South Wales, for example, it's part of the critical minerals and high-tech metal strategy, and both federal and state governments are looking at, rather than just us producing these commodities and shipping them offshore, is what manufacturing can be done internally. And there's a lot of work going on in looking at as an example, photovoltaic cells being built in Australia rather than us buying them from China and elsewhere.
So you would have quite a big market here as well as overseas.
Yeah, well, indeed, and it's really we're the miners, of course. We'll produce the metal. We're not manufacturing, but it'd be great for us to see greater manufacturing in Australia, particularly for critical minerals. And that's the reason why the federal and the state governments in Australia have a very strong drive in critical minerals and high-tech metals is having reliance on other jurisdictions for these metals is not a great position to be in. And I think it's important for us to produce and manufacture. It'd be great to see further manufacturing in Australia. I don't expect that we're going to be in the market to be building electric vehicles in Australia. Maybe there might be componentry that feed into electric vehicles, but certainly photovoltaic cells is being looked at.
Right. Okay. So there's prospects for growth in the manufacturing sector here for silver.
Yeah, hopefully. But obviously we sell our product to the smelters and they move it on to the manufacturing industries. And
who are your overseas markets? Where are your overseas markets?
Well, our product, I've talked about Port Pirie in South Australia. taking our main silver product. But as I mentioned, it can go out to any market, to anywhere in Asia or anywhere else in the world. Fortunately for us, ours is a pretty simple product without anything in there that can cause penalties in smelters. So elements in there that might cause complication in the purification process. So it's pretty simple stuff. So when we're out there marketing for our products, most smelters in the world will be very, very interested in our product, and some of them have approached us to get in our door and start talking. We're happy to do so. So it's really interesting that there's a dynamic market out there for these sorts of metals.
Well, Anthony, it's been fantastic talking to you, and thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure, Leon. Thank you.
And now let's talk to Indeed economist Callum Pickering.
Well, Callum, unemployment has eased slightly to 4%. What's your take on this?
Well, it was a pretty good set of numbers overall. I mean, it ticked most of the boxes that you like to see. Employment was pretty strong, up almost 40,000 people in the month. The unemployment rate obviously ticked a little bit lower, which is always a nice sign from an economic perspective. Most of the jobs being created were full-time as well, so that was another box ticked. So overall, it was a pretty strong, pretty reasonable set of numbers.
What will this do for the RBA? I would imagine they would be quite happy with it.
Well, one of the things they're trying to achieve, obviously, is full employment. They're trying to maintain full employment, and they're trying to do so while also bringing inflation down. That's obviously a challenging thing to achieve, but I think they would be generally quite happy with the labour market figures. The fact that the labour market remains pretty resilient, that employment continues to increase at a solid clip, that the unemployment rate is unlikely to increase materially in the near term. So all of that resilience, I think, is a welcome sign from an economic standpoint. It means that the Australian economy is absorbing the impact of those cost of living pressures and the RBA's response to that reasonably well.
The issue is with wages, although the Fair Work Commission brought in 3.75%, which was well below inflation.
Yeah, so the increase in the minimum wage was obviously much lower than we've seen over the past 2 years. And that suggests that wage growth might ease a little bit over, say, the next 12 months, below the current rate of about 4.1%. The minimum wage obviously doesn't apply to everyone. It applies to only a small percentage of workers, but it does send a pretty strong signal about what wage growth maybe should be. And so businesses and unions will look at that 3.75% increase in the minimum wage, and it will influence other wages and other awards and other decisions going forward. So it does suggest that wage growth may ease a little bit from its current level, which is quite high by historical standards. It's roughly as high as we've seen in the past 15 years. So from the Reserve Bank of Australia's perspective, they'd also be quite happy with that, because they do have some concern about the disconnect between wage growth versus productivity growth, and they want to see that disconnect close. And that can be achieved two ways: either productivity growth increases or wage growth comes down. And so it looks like they might get a little bit of that wage growth easing towards, what they would consider to be more sustainable levels.
Certainly the Fair Work Commission sort of expressed that view, that there was a disconnect with productivity as well, which is why they put it down as low as 3.75%.
Yeah, it's a big issue. I mean, not just for the Reserve Bank, but just for the economy in general. Australia's productivity performance in recent years has been poor. And, normally you want to tie wage growth to what you're seeing with productivity. Now, in the current environment, productivity is doing absolutely nothing. It was flat over the past year in terms of GDP per hour worked. Now, obviously, we don't want wages to be flat in the current environment, but that's sort of what productivity is telling us. So that sort of highlights just the disconnect we do have on the wage front versus productivity front. 4.1% wage growth over the past year, but GDP per hour worked unchanged over the past year. We need that to close, and the RBA needs that to close if they want to get inflation back to target on a sustainable level.
Well, the issue too is that you've got all these tax cuts coming in too. So the RBA will be looking at that when they meet, probably in August.
Yeah, the tax cuts provide a little bit of upside to the economic outlook. Now, obviously, these tax cuts, we've known about them well in advance, the original stage 3 and then the amended version from the Albanese government. So the RBA has sort of factored that into their thinking. But what they can't 100% know is just how people are going to respond to those tax cuts. So what will be sort of the flow through of that increased money to Australian households? Are they going to spend all of it? Are they going to save it? Are they going to pay down debt? I mean, there's always a bit of uncertainty around that. And so that can obviously create some risk, both upside and downside, with regards to the forecast for economic activity. And naturally, that will flow through and then impact the RBA's decision making.
Certainly the RBA would be doing research on that.
Oh, absolutely. They'd be looking at what's happened with past tax cuts. They'd be looking at how people react when household budgets are really tight. They'd be looking at other sort of stimulus type analysis that we've had over the years. So they're certainly doing their best guess of what's likely to happen and what percentage of those tax cuts are going to be spent versus saved. But of course, when you're dealing with household consumption, which is more than half the Australian economy, any sort of deviation in behaviour can have big impacts upon economic policy. And it's not just obviously the tax cuts, but it's also other stimulus measures, those cost of living support measures. I mean, they're essentially stimulus. They're giving people more money to spend. So it'll also be interesting to see how people react to electricity subsidies and things of that nature as well. That could also feed into that.
So all that stuff that was announced in the budget could affect it as well.
Absolutely. And that's a really interesting dynamic because those cost of living subsidies create the appearance that inflation is going to come down, but actually it's putting more money in people's pockets. It's actually increasing demand in the economy. So it's potentially going to have it's going to increase some price pressures as well, while sort of creating an illusion that inflation has actually come down quite a bit. Now, the RBA will look through that. I mean, they know that's happening, and they'll be able to model that. But it's going to be interesting to see how sort of people interpret that, and sort of particularly with regards to the media as well and other economists.
What's interesting with the inflation figures, it's 3.6%, but I mean, my feeling is that inflation is sticky. It's about 3.5, 3.6%. It's not going up massively, but it's not going down either. So, I mean, that's quite an issue for the RBA, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it was coming down quite steadily at one point. I think the RBA would have been very happy with that. And then it's proven to be quite sticky over particularly the last 3, maybe even the last 6 months. Most of that is around the service sector. And it relates to things such as, your rent and your dwelling prices and a few other categories that are very slow moving. And so that sort of contributes to them being very sticky over time. I mean, your rents are being adjusted every 12 months, sometimes every couple of years. And so it takes a long time for changes in sort of behavior there to really flow through to overall inflation. The RBA is very concerned around the stickiness of service sector prices, and rightfully so, in my opinion. We've seen a big decline, big easing in prices of goods, well, at least some goods, but we haven't necessarily seen that on the service side. And we need that to occur for the RBA to consistently achieve that 2 to 3% inflation target. They might be able to get there at some point, but whether they can stay there is sort of another question. And that feeds through to stickiness of certain sectors, the productivity problem as well. All of that sort of contributes to whether the RBA can consistently achieve its target or not.
Well, that raises 2 questions. First, part of the stickiness is with rents. You've got a whole structural issue with Australian market because you've got housing shortages, and that's driving up rents. But the other issue too is that you're saying the RBA would want to see inflation not only coming down, but coming down sustainably, not just in sort of tricks of the trade, the budget or anything like that. What's your view about that?
Well, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, I mean, the RBA isn't going to be tricked by budget measures. It is likely we will see inflation fall below 3%, but the RBA is not going to be fooled by that. They know exactly why that's happening, and certainly they'll be modelling the impact of that. They want to see inflation get down to between 2 and 3%, excluding all those budget measures. And that's a much taller ask, and that's far from certain over, say, the next 12 months. So in order to achieve that, we need to see service sector inflation come down quite a bit, probably down to around 3% on the service side. And the reason why that's okay is because typically on the goods side, you're seeing inflation of 1% or something like that, because of global competition sort of tends to drive prices down, or at least keep them contained. So if we get service sector inflation down to 3%, you've got goods at maybe 1%, 1.5%, that's going to be enough to get overall inflation down into that 2.5% region, which is obviously the sweet spot. The problem is, at the moment, service sector inflation is well above that. And so it's going to take potentially quite a long time in order to get that service sector inflation down. Now, the weakness in the overall economy suggests that it is possible. I mean, the economy itself isn't doing much. The activity was essentially flat in the March quarter. But we may need to see a sustainable period of pretty weak growth in the economy in order to sort of facilitate that downward step in service sector inflation.
So we need to see, we're going to be looking very closely at things like the retail figures, etc.
They're always important. Yeah, I mean, we are seeing a lot of weakness in the retail figures. The overall sort of nominal level of retail trade has typically been increasing, but once you account for prices and population growth, we actually have one of the weakest retail sectors, or in terms of spending activity, that we've had since the 1990s recession. So that sort of highlights just how weak things are in that sector of the economy. And what it seems like is that we're going to have that happen for a lengthy period of time in order to facilitate getting inflation back down to target.
So when do you see the RBA cutting rates?
Well, it's a great question. At the beginning of the year, I thought there was a possibility that we might see that this year. I think that's possibility is probably closed. I think next year is certainly a possibility. One of the things we need to bear in mind is that when the RBA sets policy, they're trying to do so in a forward-looking manner, because they know that there is a lengthy lag between when you change policy and when it truly impacts the economy as it flows through. And so they don't want to be reacting to the economy getting really, really bad. So what I think is likely to happen is we'll see further easing of service sector inflation. There'll be a sign that we can potentially get back to that 2 to 3% target. And the RBA will be willing to ease a little bit. It might be one cut, it might be two next year, but they'll be willing to sort of do that in anticipation that 12 or 18 months after that rate cut, they want to support the economy a little bit more.
That's quite a time lag.
It certainly is. And it's one of the things that makes monetary policy so challenging, because forecasting the economy is very difficult. Nobody's particularly good at it, but monetary policy sort of requires you to do so, because if you're just reacting to what you're seeing in the news, then it's probably too late.
Well, Callum, that's all fascinating, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Leon.
So what's happening in the news? Well, yes, it's happening around the world. A post-COVID reality is beginning to sink in. Everyone, everywhere, really is sick a lot more often. At least 13 communicable diseases, from the common cold to measles and tuberculosis, are surging past their pre-pandemic levels in many regions, and often by significant margins, according to analysis by Bloomberg News and London-based disease forecasting firm Affinity Limited. The resulting research, based on data collected from more than 60 organisations and public health agencies, shows that 44 countries and territories have reported at least one infectious disease resurgence that's at least 10 times worse than the pre-pandemic baseline. Post-COVID global surge of illnesses, viral and bacterial, common and historically rare, is a mystery that researchers and scientists are still trying to definitively explain. The way COVID lockdown shifted baseline immunities is a piece of the puzzle, as is the pandemic's hit to overall vaccine administration and compliance. Climate change, rising social inequality, and wrung-out healthcare services are contributing in ways that are hard to measure. COVID-19 is the first major global pandemic in the era of modern medicine, so there's little precedent for what comes after. The last major, devastating flu pandemic was in 1918, so we are in a new territory here, said Jeremy Farrar, World Health Organization's chief scientist. Influenza cases in the US have jumped about 40% in the two post-COVID flu seasons compared with the pre-pandemic years, according to clinical test results. Whooping cough, or pertussis, cases have climbed 45 times in China in the first 4 months compared with last year, And in some parts of Australia, where flu season is just getting underway, cases of respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, have nearly doubled from a year ago. Argentina is battling its worst ever dengue outbreak. Japan is seeing a mysterious surge of streptococcal A, also known as strep throat. Measles is making a comeback in more than 20 American states, the UK and parts of Europe. Globally, 7.5 million people were newly diagnosed with tuberculosis in 2022, the worst year on record since the World Health Organization started global TB monitoring in the mid-1990s. The theory of immunity debt has become a popular, if controversial, explanation for the post-COVID surge in illnesses. It basically means that pandemic lockdowns offered an artificial layer of insulation from routine pathogens but left people more vulnerable when the world reopened. The effect is worse for young kids, whose brand new immune systems were cosseted by social distancing, online classes and masks. Public health experts aren't convinced immunity debt might account for some resurgence of illnesses reported post-COVID, but probably not all of it. A sustained rise in mortality levels in some countries is fueling another theory, that pandemic lockdowns essentially kept some people alive who may have died in a normal environment with freely circulating viruses and bacteria. Canada, Japan, Singapore and Germany, places lauded for their successful efforts to contain COVID, are now seeing an unusual level of excess mortality. Then there's the unquantifiable role of poverty, which has spiked globally in the aftermath of their pandemic. Social inequality is the biggest risk factor for infectious disease, said David Owens, co-founder of OTMP Healthcare in Hong Kong. Overcrowded living conditions and poor access to high-quality nutrition adds to illness, increasing the amount of viral and bacterial pathogens in societies, and the ensuing strain of public healthcare systems drags down the quality of care for everyone. At the same time, a growing number of children lived in conflict or fragile environments, limiting ready access to vaccines, and COVID-era misinformation fueled simmering mistrust in vaccines in general. The state of constant illness already is taking a toll on businesses and the economy. Nearly 1 in 3 US employees in white-collar jobs took at least one sick day in 2023, according to payroll company Gusto, up 42% from 2019. And when they missed work, they missed more of it, with the average absence up 10%. And a UK study found workplace absences at the highest rate in over a decade, with employers missing nearly 8 days on average over the past year, up from 6 before the pandemic. The surge in RSV, influenza, whooping cough, and even the common cold is taxing public health resources. Despite the speed with which countries around the world left COVID-era protections behind, the lingering trail of sickness, along with the thousands of COVID deaths each month, shows the pandemic has cast a long shadow. And the Reserve Bank of Australia board has warned that recent big spending federal and state budgets may have added fuel to the inflationary fire, as it held rates steady at 4.35% for a fifth straight meeting, and said it will do whatever is necessary to bring price growth back under control. The board statement, issued following the end of a 2-day meeting, said inflation is easing, but has been doing so more slowly than previously expected, and it remains high. While recent data has been mixed, they have reinforced the need to remain vigilant to upside risks to inflation. The path of interest rates that will best ensure that inflation returns to target in a reasonable time frame remains uncertain, and the board is not ruling anything in or out, the statement said. Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers has insisted that the May budget's extra $9.5 billion in spending in 2024-25 would not make it harder for the RBA to bring inflation back under control, and boasted that handing out energy bill subsidies to every household would lower the measured rate of consumer price growth. Queensland's Labor government, facing an election defeat in October, promised in its recent budget an incredible $11.2 billion in subsidies, rebates and discounts in 2024-25. The RBA board's statement for the first time signalled a growing uneasiness among officials that generous federal and state cost of living support was working against monetary policy. Recent budget outcomes may also have an impact on demand, although federal and state energy rebates will temporarily reduce headline inflation, the statement said. And the Albanese government will introduce laws to split the CFMEU and allow its manufacturing division to leave the union in response to John Setka's war with the AFL over the past week. Workplace Relations Minister Tony Burke will introduce the bill soon after Parliament resumes next week to allow manufacturing to exit if it has support from a ballot of members, in a move likely to fuel tensions between Labor and the CFMEU's Victorian construction boss. It follows Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Mr Burke clashing with Mr Setka over his threats to disrupt AFL projects unless the league sacks its new umpires chief, Steve McBurney, because he once headed the former Australian Building Construction Commission. While Labor has been working on legislation to allow this for weeks, Mr Setka's recent behaviour is understood to have hastened the move. Mr Burke said that the bill will provide the same opportunity to manufacturing as the CFMEU's former mining division, which used coalition laws to hold a ballot of members and form its own union. We will provide the opportunity for members of the manufacturing division to vote on their future because the status quo is dysfunctional and cannot continue, he said. The members in the manufacturing division include workers in largely feminised industries like textile, and it's not hard to see why those members might want to leave. The CFMEU manufacturing division has wanted to demerge since Mr Setka turned on its secretary, Michael O'Connor, in 2020 when he failed to support the Victorian Union Chief over domestic violence charge. ACTU Secretary Sally McManus backed the government's moves as there are unique circumstances at the CFMEU and criticised Mr Setka's approach. And Peter Dutton has told his coalition colleagues will go to the next election promising to build 7 nuclear power stations. Mr Dutton will promise the first sites can be operational between 2035 and 2037, several years earlier than the timeframe the CSIRO and other experts believe is feasible. As had previously been flagged, stations are all retired coal sites. The 7 sites are Tarong in Queensland, northwest of Brisbane, Callide in Queensland, west of Gladstone, Liddell in New South Wales in the Hunter Valley, Mount Piper in New South Wales near Lithgow, Port Augusta in South Australia, Loy Yang in Victoria in the Latrobe Valley, Muja in WA near Collie. 5 of the 7 are in coalition seats. Muja in Rick Wilson's seat of O'Connor, Loy Yang in Darren Chester's seat of Gippsland, Port Augusta in Rowan Ramsey's seat of Grey, Callide, Colin Boyce's seat of Flynn, and Tarong and National Leader David Littleproud's seat of Maranoa. Mount Piper is in the seat of Calare, held by independent Andrew Gee, who was elected as a National MP in 2022 but quit the party. Liddell is the only site in a Labor seat, the seat of Hunter, held by Labor's Dan Rapaccioli. In a press release, Mr Dutton and colleagues said the locations offered important technical attributes needed for a zero-emissions nuclear plant, including cooling water capacity and transmission infrastructure. That is, we can use the existing poles and wires along with a local community which has a skilled workforce. The SA and WA sites are tapped as suitable for small modular reactors only, with the other 5 slated for either small reactors or larger scale plants, depending on what is deemed to be the best option. Mr Dutton has indicated a 2035 start date if small modular reactors are chosen and 2037 if larger plants are chosen. The Coalition is proposing the government should partially fund the plants in partnership with experienced nuclear companies and then own the plants in a similar model to Snowy Hydro and the National Broadband Network, but further funding details have not been announced, including the total cost. Mr Dutton said comprehensive site studies would be needed before that price tag could be revealed. The Coalition has been promising details of a nuclear policy, including specific sites and funding details, for several months, amid experts' concern over the cost and time frame. And rising wages, increased demand for materials and workers from housing, health, energy and defence projects, and a transition to lower carbon alternatives is driving inflation higher again in infrastructure, a new Oxford Economics Australia report says. Cost escalation that soared as much as 10% year on year in sectors such as roads and ports amid post-pandemic global pressures had come off but was now picking up again due to increasing domestic demand, even as consumer inflation was likely to remain subdued, the report says. A ramp-up of home building in the second half of the decade will challenge infrastructure projects for workers and materials, along with upcoming enterprise bargaining agreements that will lock in higher wages, as well as higher costs of still new, greener technology, it says. There may be a misconception out there that the cost of infrastructure should be falling, but in fact it's not, said Adrian Hart, Oxford Economics Australia Director of Construction and Infrastructure. It continues to grow above the cost levels that were experienced during the COVID-19 and energy crisis. Cost escalation fell as low as 2.6% last year in some sectors, but will pick up again in a booming infrastructure market, the consultancy's construction cost and inflation report says. And Bupa has signalled its intention to buy and build a national network of healthcare centres, providing GP services, allied health and pathology, as the insurer seeks to further broaden the services it offers. Bupa APAC Chief Executive Nick Stone said the strategy would be rolled out over the next few years, with 2 pilot centres already operational. The insurer will initially focus on buying existing centres, with greenfields developments also envisaged as part of the strategy. The centres will be open to the general public, as well as Bupa customers, with Mr Stone saying the vision was to provide a better service for customers and also take costs out of the healthcare system. The centres would be targeted at areas convenient to customers, within 15 kilometres from most customers, and were part of the insurer's broader Connect Care strategy, which includes a door-to-door chemist delivery service, virtual doctor consultations, and online health tools. The insurer is focusing heavily on type 2 diabetes, mental health, musculoskeletal health, and oral and eye issues as areas where it can make a difference using a suite of digital tools and physical centres. Mr. Stone said a more integrated combination of virtual tools, including access to doctors, as well as the new centres, would take a lot of friction out of the healthcare system while also providing better outcomes for patients. Maybe the first step in some cases, so you've gone into a virtual consult. You work out that you might need a physical GP consult, so you go from there into one of the health hubs, Mr. Stone said. That health hub is going to have access to, obviously, GPs, nurse-led care, for more general things like immunisations and so forth, pathology as well, and other services that we're looking at to offer in these health hubs, things around psychology, physio, and dietitian type services as well. Mr. Stone said a more seamless process for customers would ultimately lead to better clinical outcomes and also cost savings for the health system. And ASIC's latest insolvency figures indicate there were a total of 9,996 companies that had entered external administration or had a controller appointed at the 2nd of June this year. The insolvency figures for 2023-24 financial year so far are already 25% higher compared with the figure for the entire 2022-23 financial year. They also remain well above the base level average for the 2017-18-19 income years, which was 7,939. Creditor Watch Chief Economist Annika Thompson said data from the latest Creditor Watch Business Risks Index pointed to ever-increasing stress levels in the Australian business sector. Thompson said it was clear that cash flow issues were already starting to permeate through the Australian small business sector. Construction remains the sector with the highest number of insolvencies at 2,711 this year so far, followed by accommodation and food services at 1,498. The rate of insolvencies in agriculture, forestry and fishing sectors have almost doubled from last year, increasing around 89%. Other services also saw a rapid rise in insolvencies, with the number of insolvencies increasing by around 51% from the 2022-23 year. This was followed closely by professional, scientific and technical services, with a 49% increase in the number of insolvencies. ASIC had previously warned that insolvencies would likely reach 10,000 by the end of the financial year back in April. With only one quarter remaining this financial year, it's expected that the number of companies entering external administration by the 30th of June 2024 will exceed 10,000, the regulator said. It said the surging levels of company failures had not been seen since the 2012-2013 financial year, when 9,254 companies entered external administration. An Australian gambling services firm, Tabcorp Holdings, has appointed former Australian Football League AFL boss Gil McLachlan as its chief executive and managing director. The appointment comes months after former chief Adam Reichenskill resigned over allegedly using offensive and inappropriate language at the workplace, and as the firm navigates a strategic transformation amid heightened competition pressures. McLachlan was the AFL chief executive for a decade, during which he contributed to significant revenue growth and oversaw its expansion. He'll join Tabcorp on the 5th of August and assume the roles of CEO and MD upon receiving regulatory approvals, the company said. Now that is on top of his other job as external advisor to Blackstone, the world's largest alternative asset manager and the owner of Crown Resorts. And by the way, there is a connection. McLachlan and Blackstone's Australian and New Zealand chairman of private equity, James Carnegie, are coincidentally first cousins. Fancy that. Their mothers, Sylvia McLachlan, née Clark, and Carmen Clark, are sisters. Conflicts aside, at Tabcorp, McLachlan will receive an annual fixed remuneration of $1.5 million. In recent years, Tabcorp, despite enjoying retail exclusivity, has lost significant market share to its competitors during a time of seismic change to digital wagering, which was only accelerated during COVID-19. But for all the opportunity that come with the job, McLachlan takes the reins at arguably the most challenging time in wagering history, with a range of headwinds, some self-inflicted and some not, conspiring against Tabcorp. Clawing back market share and growing revenue has never been more difficult with how you can procure customers, given the significant restrictions around incentives and inducements, never more stringent. And the impost of regulations will soon become even more onerous as the wagering sector awaits a government response to its inquiry into online gambling. And that's it for this week. And next week I'll be talking to Scott O'Neill, founder and director of Rethink Invest, a Sydney-based company which started out as a commercial property buyers agency, which has now become a national company that also works as a residential buyers agency, a property law advisory agency, mortgage broking and finance company. And I'll talk to EY economist Sherelle Murphy about Australia's latest inflation figures and what these mean for interest rates. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from our website leongettler.com. If you like Talking Business, please leave us a review with Apple Podcasts. Thank you in advance. In the meantime, you catch me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube. And if you want to contact me, email me at leon@leongettler.com. I answer all emails. Also, in my copious spare time, I have a copywriting business. If anyone needs newsletters, blogs, articles or advertorial, email me. Wishing you all a safe and healthy week and looking forward to bringing you Talking Business next week.